Hello, my name is David Ades. I'm a poet based in Sydney and the host of a monthly poetry podcast reading series called Poets Corner, in association with Westwords in Parramatta in Sydney's West. Westwords is Western Sydney's literature development organisation. Poets Corner is part of Westwords' public programming that celebrates the richness, diversity and insight that literature offers. Especially in these times, we thank the ongoing support of Create New South Wales, the Cultural Fund of Copyright Australia, City of Parramatta Council, Blacktown City Council, and Campbelltown City Council, as well as the many project partners that have enabled us to continue to provide opportunities to writers and audiences. We hope that this new world will see a sharing and a closeness of spirit. As most of you would know, each month I invite a poet to read poems and talk about them for an hour or so, sometimes more, sometimes a lot more, around a theme of the poet's choice. Our guest poet today is Ian Gibbins, who won't be reading poems as such, but presenting and talking about some of his amazing video poems on the theme of limits of language, limits of experience. But first, an acknowledgement of country. I'm recording this from Beecroft in Sydney. Ian is recording from Adelaide in South Australia. I'd like to pay my respects to and acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, of the Wallameda people, the traditional custodians of the land in Beecroft, and also of the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians of the land of the Adelaide Plains, and to acknowledge that they are the sovereign owners of their land, which has never been ceded or given up. Ian Gibbins is a poet, video artist, and electronic musician living on unceded Kaurna land in South Australia. His poetry has been widely published in Australia and overseas and includes 4 books, 2 of which are collaborations with visual artists. His award-winning poetry videos, video art and soundscapes have been exhibited to acclaim at festivals, installations, galleries and public art displays around the world. Until he retired in 2014, Ian was an internationally recognised neuroscientist and Professor of Anatomy at Flinders University, South Australia, having originally trained as a zoologist. The CV is pages and pages and pages long, but Ian's given me a very short version. For details of Ian's website, you can go to www.iangibbins, that's gibbins.com.au. For Ian's videos, you can see them at https://vimeo.com/Ian Gibbins. And for Ian's audio work, you can go to https://iangibbins.bandcamp.com/. After all that, hi Ian and welcome to Poets Corner.
Hey, hello, David. It's a great pleasure to be here and see you again in virtual South Australia.
It's been a while. Look, when I first knew you back in the day at Friendly Street Poets, I knew you as a poet on the page. And indeed, you published, as mentioned, 4 books, collections of poetry. How and when did you transition to expand your practice to video poetry, and what prompted your movement into that mode of poetry?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't quite remember the details of it all, I must say, but it happened relatively gradually, not that long ago. So I first started playing around with video technology when I was still working, and so we were making videos primarily for teaching, and all of my lectures were being recorded at Flinders Uni online, and then we were editing those and doing teaching videos made from them. And it was a very simple way of making videos. I was using PowerPoint and doing animated transitions in PowerPoint, animated text, and just saving it as a video file. And that was very effective, very easy way of making a video from still images, and also from moving image as well. That was one part of it. So I sort of had some basic knowledge there. We had in 2008 or 2009, I was part of a collaborative installation exhibition at the Flinders University City Gallery called With Body and Mind. And it was an exploration of how we perceive the body, an artistic exploration of how we perceive the body. And as part of that installation, I made some soundscapes, and I also made some animated movies for that, which were done using PowerPoint. But I needed to do some finer quality editing, so I got a digital editing program, which got me interested in this is how digital video works. So that was one part of it. Another part of it was that for quite a while, I'd started putting some of my poems to music, doing music and doing backing tracks for my poems, mostly for live performances around the place. And I enjoyed doing that. And then I got the idea, well, people make music videos, why don't I make poetry videos? And so I started doing that. And at the time, I didn't know very much about the broader video art, video poetry community. There's virtually none of it in Australia, not video poetry anyway. And I just did it because it seemed a fun thing to do. And there were some events coming up around town, poetry events. And I thought, well, what do we do with video and do live? So I do live performance in front of with the video in the background. So I did that at Queensland Poetry Festival. I did it at the Fringe Festival here in Adelaide a couple of times. And there were a couple of other events around town here, probably about 10 years ago now. And people really liked them. It's pretty good. And so from there, I started thinking more about the process. I learned the underlying animation engine for the software that I use. So I paid for tutorials in the software that I use, and really got on top of the whole video production process, which I really love. And then in the last 5 years, especially the last 3 years, it's just gone crazy. It's done incredibly well.
Ian, you've chosen for your theme limits of language, limits of experience. Was your movement into video poetry a response to what you felt were the limits of language on the page?
Yes, in part. So I've always been interested in the fact that poetry and experimental writing in general allows a way of looking at language, a way of looking at the expression of experience, I suppose. That's generally not available in certainly in prose, and even sometimes in a novel. I like the idea of poems being short, condensed, little pieces of experience, if you like. And what turning to video lets me do is to create a visual world within which the language is embedded. And part of the reason I like doing that, part of the reason it attracted me so much, is that I'm a really visual writer. So for every poem I've written, I imagine a scene, a visual environment. It might be an imaginary one sometimes. Sometimes it's a vision, an image, not a vision, an image that comes from maybe a dream or just something you imagine, or sometimes it's a what if type environment. And using video lets me then create that visual environment, and in some cases to really ground the text in the visual environment that I had in mind when I wrote it. Sometimes the environment, the visual environment is generated. I generate it to fit the text. Sometimes I fit the text to the environment. It works both ways.
So writers are always wrestling with language, trying to make it bend to what they want it to do, or flexing the form, as Stuart Barnes said in a recent podcast, and often coming up against its limitations. Can you say something about your own experiences with the limits of language in your writing?
Yeah, well, there's two things about the limits of language, I think, that informs the way I work. And it does come back from my knowledge of neuroscience, cognitive science, sort of how the brain works, how we process information on one hand, and how we generate language on the other. So the first thing is that language is incredibly good at describing a lot of different things. So we're communicating now. I had a little glitch there. Communicating now with language that we both understand and we more or less know what we're both talking about, I hope. But there's lots of things that language is hopeless at. And so language is not very good at explaining emotions, for example. And it's one reason that poetry has a lot of strength. A lot of poetry is really about trying to get the words around these feelings that you literally can't put into words. I feel so happy I can't put it into words. I feel so sad I can't express how sad I feel. I mean, these are things in day-to-day speech which people acknowledge. It's also created a huge industry in cards, greeting cards and message cards and things like that, where professional people try and find 25 words to explain something that people otherwise can't put into words. So that's one important area where language commonly fails. Another area which is even more dramatic is the description of movements, the descriptions of actions. So a huge amount of our brain is devoted to language, but an even bigger amount of our brain is devoted to movement, how we manipulate things with our hands, how we navigate our way through the physical world. And a really large amount of our brain is involved in doing that. And most of it is non-verbal. So again, in day-to-day speech, day-to-day language, you have phrases like, well, when all else fails, look at the instructions. Just shut up and show me how to do it. And if you try to explain to someone how to change a tire on a bicycle over a telephone, it's not a very successful exercise usually, but if you just show someone how to do it, it works a treat. And it's the same going even to the video production. I paid quite a bit of money to get some online video tutorials. Well, they didn't tell you how to do it. They showed you how to do it.
Yeah.
So those two things are places where it's well known that language just doesn't work, and the way in which we understand the world through physical interactions is almost entirely independent of the way we understand it through language and through naming conventions, through grammar and all the rest of it. That's the first thing. The second thing about the impossibility or the breakdown of language is that our conscious experience of being alive and an active agent in the world is a highly constructed experience. And it's just really glossing over the top of all the things that our brain's doing to keep us alive and keep us functioning and interacting with the world. So as we're sitting here talking to each other, looking at each other through the screen, I'm concentrating on the screen. I'm looking at you. Now I've thought about it. I actually can see at the corner of my eye what's happening outside, but I hadn't been thinking about that until I mentioned it. Until I mentioned it, you're probably not thinking about what your left hand's doing, but you probably are now. And now, can you think about your left and your right hand at the same time as your big toe? It's pretty hard. And then if you start thinking about that, you're not listening to what I'm saying. So we can only focus on our attention on a small amount of the world at a time. And part of that is due to just incredibly fast, incredibly efficient, almost real-time sensory processing. So the visual system, the auditory system, our sense of body, where we are in our body and in space, we're only actively attending to a very, very small amount of that at any particular time. But our brain, our nervous system, is doing all of that all the time. It actually is processing huge amounts more information than we can actually attend to at any particular time. So our conscious experience is just a little moving window of all possibilities of things that we could be experiencing at any particular time. And then just below that, there's a surface, just below that surface, there's this huge mishmash of fleeting experiences, and if that we already have, of little bits of memory and little bits of experience. So if you just stop for a second and just think what's happening in your brain right now. What were you thinking?
Not much.
Who knows? Maybe not much, but something would have been happening. If you concentrate on it, you might have had a little flash of a cup of coffee, or a dog, or the newspaper headlines, or what you're going to do tomorrow, or the pain that you've got in your big toenail because you forgot to cut it, or something like that. And the little flicks, flick, 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 little flickering bits of imagery, usually visual, but they can be auditory as well. They can be olfactory. They can be body sensations. Quite often, just before you go to sleep, there's a state called the hypnagogic state, in which all these little fleeting memories, little fleeting bits of experience come to the front of your conscious experience just before you go to sleep. Now, having said all of that, how do you describe that? I mean, I've been trying for the last couple of minutes to explain what it all is, but the actual lived experience is really vivid. It's really strong, and you can't put that into words very easily. One of the reasons is that it takes too long to explain it. So it's taken me 5 minutes to try and explain something which happens in fractions of a second. You can't do it. So all you can do is approximate. And so a lot of my poetry, the written poetry on the page, and then going to the video, is trying to explore that interface between sort of, I suppose, rational conscious experience and this sort of just all this stuff going on just below the surface. And it's ambiguous, it's sometimes contradictory, and the full structure of grammatical language probably isn't necessary to capture it. So that's why I try.
Okay, I love it. So the other part of that theme is the limits of experience. I'm intrigued by that notion, and perhaps what you've been talking about is touching on it. I mean, it's part of human nature to always push against limits. What do you see as the limits of experience that perhaps you're pushing against in your poetry?
Well, it's a continuation of what I've just been saying. So the limits of experience is at any particular time, like as it used the example now, as we're sitting here now, what is it that we're actually experiencing, and how much of it can we actively record, either as memory, as something that you might want to transfer to a written record or a videographed record or something like that. So we just come up with an example right now off the top of my head. If you had to write down, if we both wrote down what had happened 10 minutes ago when the Zoom line dropped out, what would we write? Would we write the same things? Well, we might, but we probably wouldn't. And would the experiences be the same? No, by definition, they're not, because I'm here in Adelaide and you're in Parramatta. So by definition, they're different. I'm looking at this on a Mac screen, and you probably look at yours on a laptop or a phone or something. I can't quite see where you are, but it's something different. I can see that you've got some louvers and things. It looks like you're out in the veranda where you're sitting. I'm in my room, but also looking out onto a beautiful garden with a Wollemi pine growing on the veranda. Looking at the stuff in the background, behind me, there's bits of cameras. There's a beautiful drawing from an artist I worked with a couple of years ago. I can see yours. There's a night light out there, and there's some bay windows, and there's something I can't see. It looks like a maiden hair fern or something pot in the background. You're wearing glasses. I'm not. I've got a beard. You haven't. We're both running out of hair. So the experiences are necessarily different. And it's sort of obvious,
Yeah.
but it's something which it's often just overlooked. So if I write a poem about what I experience of a particular event, it's necessarily personal. It's always first person, no matter what I write it. Not if I write a story about David did this and David did that and David did this and then he did this and then he did that, it's still my point of view. It's still my viewpoint. It's still a record of my experience, real or imagined, about what David was doing. So it's always first person. So I really strongly believe that all writing is first person experience, no matter what the grammatical phrasing of it is. And the other thing is that, which comes out of what I was saying earlier, I suppose, I consider that all my poems are fictions, no matter what they're writing about. They're fictions. So sometimes it's quite overt. So I will sometimes invent a voice, and I have in mind a particular character or a particular way of speaking, or as I said earlier, nearly always in a well imagined visual environment. So I know where I am when that voice is speaking. Then I'll make up these voices. And one of the good things about the video poetry is that I can actually change my voice. And so a lot of my poems, I'll repitch the voice, I'll change the timing of it, I'll put it through filters, or I'll get someone else to read it. I get the computer voices to read them, so I can have a female voice read it, or I can have an American voice read it, or a German voice, or Spanish, or whatever. So, so these are all versions of limits of experience, because you're limited. Our brain can't process everything, so it's necessarily limited. And then when we try to recapture it and try to express what we're feeling, what we've experienced, what we're thinking about, what we've imagined, there's limits on that too. And I suppose the final thing is the limits of language depends on what language you're using too. So, I mean, I'm a natural native English speaker, but I know German quite well. I can read French. I can't speak French, and I've been learning Spanish because I've got so many Spanish colleagues at the moment. And doing translations of the poems into these other languages is a fantastic way of seeing how the options available to you in language vary depending on what words those languages have, what concepts, how a particular language chooses to frame with words a particular experience, a particular object, a particular action.
So the video poem form opens up a whole lot of things for you that you would not otherwise be able to access. Is it also a way of playing in sort of across multiple fields? And you play with language. It's very clear from the language when we get to your poems that there's a lot of play there, and you're playing with sound and you're playing with music. The image scape is all a bit of play for you, is it?
Absolutely. It's got to be fun, otherwise it's not worth doing. So doesn't mean it's not always hard. You know, it's often hard work, and it's often a grind, and to get it right, whatever that means, to meet whatever creative output I want. It makes it sometimes it's hard to do that. But yeah, but play is really important, and there's actually a large research field about play in humans and animals, and the importance of play in letting your brain and body practice things it can't otherwise do. It's a way of exploring new ideas, new ways of interacting with the world. So that's really important. And the notion of play in the videos, it's a good question. I hadn't thought of it quite like this, but it's there, and quite often in my videos that I try to create visual scenes which are as ambiguous as the text is. leave the viewer wondering what actually happened there. What's going on there?
Yeah, I get that. I thought that a few times when I viewed these videos. Do you think that this kind of poetry is at the cutting edge of poetry now, in a way,
Um,
or one of the many cutting edges?
yeah, I think it's one of them. So I've always been interested in experimental writing, and that goes back to Dada poets, surrealists, and then the people like James Joyce and William Faulkner, who are interested in trying to portray the inner workings of the mind, the way imagination works. I was interested in all that before I was doing neuroscience. It's always been my interest. And then I was really interested in the French new novelist, what do I call it, roman nouvelle, Alain Rodriguez, especially his earlier work before he got a bit perverted. And then the Oulipo group, Georges Perec and his colleagues, which were all about this combination of process, ways of exploring language at the edges of language, again, versus the edges of experience. And I've always liked the idea of the trade-off between absolute pure randomness and stochastic processes and highly rigorous, predefined protocols for generating creative output. And the Oulipo group in particular did a lot of that. So they devised these rules for generating language. So you want to get some words, well, you go to the dictionary and pick a word at random, then move 7 words on from that and use that word. And you have to use that word in your text. The Oulipo people did things like using chessboard moves as a way of constructing narrative. Wow, that was pretty fancy. And when it's done well, you don't notice it. You know there's something fancy going on, but you're not quite sure what. And in a way that we go, this trade-off between highly structured investigation of a creative space versus sort of random stochastic ways of moving through that same area, it reflects science in a way a lot too. So, people often contrast creative arts versus the rigor of science, as science being all very hard-nosed and very procedurally based, compared to arts, which is all running off your emotions and running off the top of your head and all the rest of it. Well, neither of those views is true. and in science, you're flip-flopping all the time between, wow, I wonder what happens if we do this. Let's try this and let's do that. Versus, oh, that didn't work. Oh, hang on, this one might work. So how do you make sure that it works properly every time and that we've got it right? So that happens in science. And good science is an appropriate mix of those two things. And I think in a lot of the creative arts, the same thing too. You have your crazy ideas, but then you have to work on the technique to get those ideas out in a way that someone else can experience. And crafting the language, crafting the image, crafting a stage production, crafting a movie, whatever. But there's a lot of overlap in those processes. The balance is different, and how the end product is judged in some ways is different. But I think most of the time there's a lot of overlap there.
Your video poems seem to be selected for film festivals all over the world. Can you tell us a bit about how that happened for you, how you got them out into the world?
Yeah, well, in lots of ways, it's no different to poetry publishing. So you send stuff off, and most of the time it gets rejected. And then you get something in. You think this is really, really good, and then you never get anything in that place ever again. So that process is exactly the same. So there are I get my work out. There's probably, off the top of my head, there's probably three types of venues or formats that I get the work in. So internationally, there's quite a well-established circuit for video poetry or poetry videos. People argue about what's the correct phrase for that. Is it a video poem or a poetry video? I don't care, but some people do. And so there's a circuit for those, and some of those festivals have been running for quite a long time now. Some new ones pop up around the place from time to time, and they vary quite a lot in their style and how they select the entries. They're all curated. Nearly all of them are curated, and some of them are big. They'll have maybe 80 films shown over a couple of days. Some of them are quite small and they might only have 8 or 10 shown in an afternoon. Some of them are live theatre events where the video is projected on the screen with a live audience, and usually those are usually associated with other events like real live poetry readings or discussions or live music, or things like that. Other events are done entirely online, so they're streamed through a video streaming service of some sort, and they may well have some online discussions with the artists. And lots of festivals these days, post-COVID, are hybrid, so they'll have some things streamed, they'll have some live events, and sometimes they'll have initially the festival will be entirely live, and then a selection of the videos will be available for streaming, either through a video library or sometimes a pay-per-view, or sometimes just for a limited time, just for a couple of weeks after the festival. So you have all these different ways of doing things, and they're all really good. So I really love the hybrid models, because I can then go and take part in the festivals from Australia. I've been to a couple in real time, but it's expensive these days to do that. So that's one. They're the poetry video festivals, and they're really great, and I really love getting work in them. But there's some I've never been accepted, like in 5 years or 6 years, and I don't know why. And sometimes you go, just like with poetry submissions, you think, how come I didn't get in that? And then you go and look at what the final collection is, and you can see, oh yeah, no wonder. They're all fantastic. There's no way mine's in that league. Or another thing is that, well, that's the sort of thing they wanted. That's the style they wanted. I mean, that's not my style. It's never going to be. Bad luck. Who cares? Doesn't matter.
There seem to be a lot more of these festivals now. Is that right?
Yeah, well, there's more video poetry festivals than there were. There's not a lot. There's probably about a dozen. I suppose about 10 or 12 around the world. Regularly. But actual film festivals, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of film festivals, and it's a real trick figuring out which are the right places to submit your work. You commonly have to pay some sort of submission fee, which can be quite modest, which I don't mind paying, because I know it costs money to run a proper festival, to run a video streaming site and all the rest of it. Some of them are actual total rip-offs. It's just a money gathering exercise for the promoters, and some sit in between, and it's hard to know about those. So the poetry overall, I've had more of my films shown in video art festivals or in independent video festivals than I have shown in poetry festivals, which is really gratifying, because it means that I'm getting my work to a broader audience, and it's not just people interested in poetry who are reading these things. And it's interesting there, because I think that my approach to using language on screen and a lot of the audio processing that I do is is unusual. Not many people do it like that in either video poetry or even in video art. So people seem to like it, and it gets work out in places which include some reasonably serious film festivals around the place, which is amazing. I'm always totally amazed that they get in there.
Yeah.
And then the third area where things get shown is in galleries and exhibitions, installations, special events, and things like that. So they're usually called out by curators and sometimes by word of mouth. But I've had a lot shown in that around Adelaide, around the country, various galleries around the country. Sometimes public art installations where you have stuff screened on an outdoor screen or on a side of a building. I've had that here in Adelaide. I've had that in Perth, Mexico City, Edinburgh. You played somewhere in Holland, I think, last year. So that's another way where people get out. And again, it's rare to have text-based videos in those sort of environments.
I was going to ask who the audiences are. I guess it's going to be a very diverse group.
Yeah, it's really diverse. Yeah. So the audiences really vary a lot. So the people at the video poetry events are mostly poets and video poetry people. At the independent film festivals, there's almost no poet. They're not poetry people. I mean, they're film people, and they're mostly artists or video artists. So out there in video land, in filmmaking land, you can sort of there's a bit of a divide in the independent film industry or business, or what do you want to call it. So at one end, there's people like me who basically work by themselves as an artist and create these little, usually short videos, usually less than 10 minutes, by themselves, or maybe with a couple of collaborators. Maybe if lots of people will have a musician they work with. Sometimes you'll have a poet who works consistently with a filmmaker, and they work together on their projects. But they're generally small scale productions, and usually don't involve masses of actors and directors and all that sort of, and producers and all that sort of stuff. The other side of independent filmmaking, the sort of stuff which comes out of film schools. And so you have people who are making short films, but with like Hollywood type productions values. So they'll have actors, they'll have proper sets, they'll have script writers and makeup artists and caterers, and they cost a lot of money to make. So they might cost $10,000, $15,000 to create a 5-minute or 8-minute short film, like a short drama or a short documentary or something like that. I mean, an 8-minute film for me doesn't cost me anything other than my time and how much I've spent on software and my cameras and lighting and things like that. But I don't have to pay anybody to take part in my films. So there's a bit of a divide there. And one of the things which is sometimes hard to, and when it comes to looking at the independent film festivals, some of them are really slanted towards the sort of the full production model, and some of them are slanted more towards the independent artist model, and some are in between. And when it comes to video poetry, it's quite interesting that most people in the video poetry scene are independent artists, so people like me, or sometimes I said working with collaborators. But quite often, winning films in the festivals come from a more production house type setup. And what happens there is that a filmmaker and a poet get together and they decided they don't do this one-off project. So they decide, well, let's make a film about your poem, and they do these incredible productions. But that's the only one they ever do.
Yeah.
The poet never does another one, and the filmmaker never works with a poet again. But some of those films are absolutely brilliant, unbelievably good, and you just wish. Sometimes I think, oh, it'd be really nice to do a full production one day, and have a studio and actors and have a full blown narrative production just to see what it would be like. It may happen, I don't know, who knows. But so it's very interesting, and that's they're the two ends of this sort of diverse range. And then there are also some production houses. There's one in America, and there's another one in Germany, which sort of commission video makers, filmmakers, and poets to work together on video poetry projects. So there's a mob in America. They're called Motion Poems.
Yes.
And I mean, you don't submit to Motion Poems. They commission an established filmmaker to work with an established poet to produce one video. And they've got a fantastic library. There's 100 of films there, and they're all terrific.
Exquisite,
But they're all one-offs. Those people rarely go on to make any more poetry films. And then sometimes a poetry film festival will say, we're going to ask for films to be made about this poem. And they select a poem, and you have to make a film about that poem, using that poem as the source. I haven't done that. I don't like doing that. But lots of people do. And that's another way in which you get work done. But again, they tend to be one-offs then. You tend to get a filmmaker working with that poem, and often with a good actor to read the poem, perform the poem, or something like that. And they're often amazing. I really like watching those festivals to see you get 10 slants on the same poem in a way that it simply could not do with a reading. If you got 10 people to get up and read the same poem, everybody's going to be asleep by the third one. There's not that much difference in the way you read a poem, but the way you interpret a poem visually is a very different thing.
Now, before we talk about the poem, I had another question. I wanted to ask you about process. In terms of the idea for a video poem, you've touched on this, but I want to expand on it a bit. What comes first, text or soundscape or imagescape?
Any or all. It just varies from one to the other. So sometimes I'll have the poem and I think, oh, this would be good to make a film about this, usually because I have this strong visual framing of my poems anyway. Sometimes I think, oh, I just like the voice in this. It'd be good to visualize that voice and work around it that way. And then I'll go out and film quite explicitly. I'll go out, look for think of locations, go and film stuff. I've got a huge library of stuff. I'm always photographing stuff and filming stuff just in case it turns out to be useful one day. And I've got terabytes of files sitting just behind the screen here. And quite often I know I've got stuff there that I can use, and I'll go back and do it. Sometimes I will have a sound file that I've made, a soundscape that I've made, which I've just had sitting there, and I think, oh, actually some words will go with this, or some images will go with that. And then whichever one I haven't got, I'll then write the words or go out and create the images. Sometimes I just know I've got this little collection of videos that I know would make something really good. And then I work around with them and essentially write something to suit the videos and the sound. So it works all different ways, and in the end, it ends up being an iterative process, going backwards and forwards between the audio, the words, the actual text itself, and the video. When it comes to actually making the video, I nearly always drive it from the audio. So I get the audio sorted out first. And the reason for that is that I like to have the movement in the transitions in the video very, very tightly linked to the text and to the underlying sound. And to make that easier, when I do the sound, I tend to do the music composition or the soundscape composition on a very limited set of tempos. So I tend to do about 120 beats a minute, 135 beats a minute, 150 beats a minute, or 180 beats a minute. And what that means is that when I want to line up the rhythm, the beats, of the audio, they fall on exact seconds. And then when I want to line it up with the video, I do frame level editing of the video, which is 25th of a second or something like that. Then everything lines up. It just makes it much, much, much easier at a technical end, and pulling all those elements together. And then it's really flexible. Then the final process of pulling it all together, the editing process, it can take ages. So, I mean, a 4-minute video, mostly I take between 4 months and 12 months to make a video. Wow. And so I've got an exhibition coming up in October, and I think I've just finished one of the pieces for that. It's a long piece. It's nearly 12 minutes long, but I've been working on that for 3 years. And in terms of answering your question, what comes first, the idea for that came from a single word. And this word came up called microrefugia, a micro-refuge, a place in the environment where tiny creatures or tiny plants can live. And I came up in the idea I actually applied for a residency, which I didn't get, but the application was written around this idea, and that idea stuck with me. And I've been collecting film. I've been collecting footage for that for 3 years, and I finally finished it, I think, last week. I wrote text especially for it. The soundtrack was really complex, with lots of samples recorded out in the garden, out in the nearby national park. I did lots of animation to create scenes that looked real, but just disturbingly not quite real. And in the end, most of it was filmed out I did out in the garden, ran just out the window here. So that's a good example of that process where everything iterated backwards and forwards.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's a lot of intuition involved in it as well. So it's partly an intuitive process rather than a really structured, crafted process from the outset.
It's both. And it's absolutely both. It's like we said earlier, the interplay between the structure and the intuition is ongoing. So I don't know what I'm doing when I fiddle with something to get it to look right. What does that mean? Who knows? You can't explain. It's another place where language fails. It just is. It's just right. For some internal standard that you have. Who knows what that is? I don't think it's possible to explain that. On the other hand, when I'm doing the video, I can do things and say, "Oh, that transition is not right because it's 0.3 of a second too late, and it's out of sync with the audio by half a second or something." That's something that's obvious and that's analytical, and I can go back and into the technology and push the technology and get that right. or I can say, I really want this thing to look like this or that. How on earth do I do that? Then I go and spend, a month learning how to generate some particular type of animation, which is just hardcore skills learning. And sometimes I have to go and learn some new technology. Sometimes I have to learn some coding. Sometimes I have to upgrade my computer to do it. And that's just like being in the lab. And you got to persevere, because just like in the lab, most of the time the experiments don't work. Most of the time, most of the things you try don't work. It's amazing when they do.
Mm. Well, we should perhaps get onto some of the poems, I think. And the first one we're going to talk about is called After Image, which you've said is about the traces of things that we may or may not have actually seen. We're just getting back to this After Image poem. Do you think the text of the poem would work as a standalone poem, or does it need the other aspects of sound and video to be complete now that you're doing it in this form?
Good question. It must work as a standalone poem because it got published. I can't remember where now. I think it was in eRatio, which is a fantastic journal of sort of experimental poetry. It's been running for many years. I've had quite a lot of work published there, so it's already been published. It works well as a performance piece. I really love performing this as a reading. It's really, really, really fun to read, and I like doing that. And then the version which is on the video is a slightly different version. Again, it's important to say I have different versions of the texts depending on what I'm using them for. So the version on the video is quite often different from the version that was originally published, if it's been originally published, and quite often there'll be a third version, which is my performance version.
Just don't move then. Just wait. Wait then to final return.
And I love the editing process. That's the best part. I've always really enjoyed editing my own work. I really like rewriting work for different context. So as I'm producing stuff for a video poem, it may turn out that I end up using a set of images which wasn't what I originally had in mind, but which clearly work. And then that cuts across the text. And then I decide, well, I need to change the image, or I need to change the text. Well, it's quite often I'll change the text and have a different version of it for that. So After Image, yeah, it works. I really like this because it works in all those different ways.
I've heard it said that a poem is never completely written until the poet dies, because it's always capable of being rewritten.
Yeah, well, sooner or later you got to stop. With the video stuff, one of the things with the videos is that the software is always being upgraded, and sometimes it's actually quite hard to go back and edit it without having to remake the whole thing. Yeah. So I must admit, I don't edit the videos very much afterwards, but sometimes you have to. So I've got one accepted for a poetry festival in Germany, and they want the video in a very technical format, which not many places do. So I've had to outsource that to a production company to make the video in the format that they want. And to do that, I had to go back to my original video files and re-render it to a technical specification, which will allow the next stage of the technical specs to be done. So, and as part of doing that, I actually had to check to make sure that that version still had all the words were still right and the timing was all right and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, in the After Image poem, I was very intrigued by the language in the poem. I mean, I just love what you do with language anyway. combination of words that you put together that are unorthodox, like rumble cloud and letter them open. I mean, I just love that idea. And wild dog brain cunning. Do you use words differently for a video poem than you would for just a poem on the page? I mean, it sounds like you do if you're writing different versions for different things.
No, I don't. I've always written words like that to varying degrees, and these days I've been making more. I go through phases where I sort of spend a lot of time making up words and seeing how they fit. I've always liked that, and that comes back, I suppose. I mean, you've got to thank James Joyce for that. And I mean, for years and years, when I got given a copy of a Bodley Head edition of Ulysses as a prize for something English, I suppose, at school, and I always had it on my bedhead when I've nothing else to do. I just open up a random page and read some of Ulysses, and I've always loved it. And then sometime later, it was the same with Finnegan's Wake. So I had Finnegan's Wake sitting on the end of my bed for 20 years, and I had nothing else to do. I just open up it somewhere and just read it out loud, and get all this stuff in your head, and it's fantastic. I love it. So I really like that, and then I also like the notion of translation and mistranslation too. And so the idea of, if you like, translating English into itself, mistranslating English into itself is something I like. And part of that goes back to looking at earlier forms of English, and you look at like the Shakespeare, for example, but even just like the diaries of the explorers, somewhat Matthew Flinders, it's only 100, 200 years ago or something like that. They're using words in different ways to what we use now. Go back to Australian slang, and post First World War, they're using words and phrases which we don't use now, and sometimes we can understand them still, sometimes we can't. So I just like that malleability of language, and the fact you can string words together in novel ways, and people generally seem to get them. And one of the best compliments I've ever had was from out of a reading one night somewhere, and someone said, "Oh, I don't know about your poems, Ian. I don't know what you're talking about, but I know what you mean." Yes, yeah, that's it. Success.
So in this video poem, you're interrogating ideas about after images. Did anything in particular inspire that work?
I can't remember now, I have to say. The notion of after that, again, it's like a lot of my writing. It's operating at a couple of different levels. So the notion of after image as a physiological thing, as a neurological thing, is something that I used to teach about. So the idea of after image is that if you stare at something long enough and then look away at a blank wall or something like that, you can sort of see a negative image of what it was that you're looking at. And the most extreme version of that, if you look at a bright light for too long with the sun or something like that, you get a dark spot in your visual field of where that bright spot was originally. So this idea of having something persisting in negative after you've spent a long time looking at it is a very appealing metaphor, I think, which has a very deep underlying biology behind it. And the biology of that after image is actually very, very complicated. And there's things happening in your eye, there's things happening in your brain which generate that image.
Yeah.
But then as a metaphor, the notion of the country that we live in having originally been lived in by people tens of thousands of years before us, up to 200 years before us. We talked about Ghana country here. the indigenous inhabitants, but also the animals and plants and animals and that too. So the area where I live here in Bel Air in the Adelaide Hills, it's on the edge of native woodlands, and just across the road we've got some remnant native woodland, but it's pretty degraded. There's lots of weeds, lots of animals and birds that used to be around when we first moved here 40 years ago are no longer here. They've gone. So this notion of there being plants and animals and people who inhabited this space, interacted with it, changed it in their own way, left their legacy on it in their own way, through cultural means, through evolutionary means, ecological means. It's all around us. We can't escape it. And because they've gone, it's necessarily a negative after image. Another meaning of negative. It's something which is gone. So they were the two things that sort of informed that poem. And I mean, a lot of my writing, a lot of my films these days are focused on environmental stuff. I find it hard to do anything else these days.
Yeah,
but nevertheless, the context of the language around that is most of the time drawing on lots of other things as well. So I've got one I just finished screening last week, which is based on the notions of Moby Dick and marine animals, but it was inspired by Moby Dick. It's about the ongoing destruction of the environment. So
yeah, it's a hard subject to get away from now.
Yeah.
In this poem, do you want to challenge the idea that seeing is believing?
Absolutely. Yes. It's a trick. In like all our conscious perception is it's sort of a trick, so that the visual scenes that we experience is something which is synthesized by our brains, and it takes time to do it. And it's a combination of processing that starts in the eye itself, in the retina of the eye. There's already processing going on there, and then there's a whole series of steps of processing go on in the brain, which identify small features in the environment like edges, different shapes, different colours, different patterns of movement, what's foreground, what's background, what are you attending to, what are you not attending to, and all of that eventually gets through to your conscious experience of vision. And that takes time. It takes between a third of a second and half a second for us to generate that lived visual experience. And like we talked about earlier, you could only concentrate on part of it at a time. So as I'm talking, my visual experience is the screen in front of me, not out the window. I can see out the window, out the corner of my eye. In fact, I can see by looking on the screen via the camera. But I need to actually turn around and look out to actually see what's actually happening outside. So in that sense, our visual experience is an internal creation of our brain. Now, does that mean it's wrong? Most of the time, it's not, because it can't afford to be wrong. If you get it wrong, you're going to die. You know, if you get wrong the location of the steps in front of you, you're going to fall down and break your leg. If you get it wrong, the speed of a car approaching before you cross the road, you're going to get hit by the car and you're probably going to die. If you get wrong the location of the on-off switch on a power point, stick your finger in it and it's the wrong way around, you're going to die. So there's a lot of selective pressure to get the visual world as accurate as possible. But it doesn't mean and that's true, but it's very, very easy to muck it up. I mean, there are all sorts of visual illusions. You can go online and find dozens of visual illusions where things look bigger than what they really are, things look the wrong color compared to what they really are, things appear to move when they're not, or so on and so forth. All those visual illusions are using specific visual cues to trick or to undermine the neural processing of the visual pathways. So it's a trick. And now what led to the making the video for After Image was just something I happened to notice one day. So a lot of the video for that is filmed around Port Adelaide, and I'm for a few years now I've been part of a group of artists who exhibit at Harts Mill in Port Adelaide. Now, Harts Mill is an old grain processing mill that was originally built in the 1800s and was a major site for producing flour for the colony of South Australia, and also for exporting wheat to other parts of the colony. And this is a fantastic building there where we get access to have exhibitions once or twice a year. And a lot of After Image, a lot of the footage there is taken in Harts Mill and around that place. And what struck me was that in the mornings, you get this fantastic optical effect. So the front of the building that we work in has glass windows, like shop front windows, and cars park out the front, angle parked. And at the right time of the morning, the sun reflects off the windows of the cars through the window at the front of the building. And anybody who is in the front of the building, their shadows get projected right down onto the far wall of the building. And so you see the shadows of people walking out in the street, the shadows of people working at the front of the building, enlarged, but in perfectly sharp focus on the back wall of the building. It's an incredible effect. And it's only about 1 hour a day where the sun is in exactly the right spot for that to happen. And it's magical when it happens. So one day we were there, we were setting up the exhibition. There's almost no one else there other than people working in the front room. And I realised I could recognise the people just by their profiles. And so I was filming it with my phone, and that became the core visual concept for that video. And then we were not round about the same time, we're sitting in a pub somewhere, having lunch, having dinner, and the same thing happened. There was reflections off the car windows outside. It was reflecting through the front window of the pub onto the wall of the pub. And there's all these fantastic shadows going up on the wall. And again, I just filmed that. And they became another core element of the film. So nearly all of the shadows, nearly all the scenes have these shadows drifting around the place. And they were either filmed in the pub or at Harts Mill. And then I needed some more. And I need some more shadows to have this character, this sort of shadowy character drifting around. And then I realised I could use some video technology to generate that. So we've got at the wall just outside here is a large light coloured wall. And I realised that if I dressed myself completely in black and wore a hoodie, so covering my head, black gloves and black shoes, black jumper, black trackies or something. And if I moved slowly in front of that wall, then I could create a ghost figure, a shadow figure. So I did that, filmed myself doing that. And that's the other figure that you see moving through the video at the various places. So at the opening sequence, first of all, there's a shadow moving across the floor, and there's a shadow walks across the wall. Both those are me. But they've been composited and animated and built into the original images inside Harts Mill. And then some of the other scenes, they're composited from sometimes 7 or 8 different elements. So there's window frames from one building. There's the projected shadow on the wall from one of these scenes I originally filmed. There's me walking through the space. There's a floor made from another location. There'll be a back wall made from another location again. So most of the scenes in that video are composited from many different elements. Yeah.
So when you're looking at limits of experience, limits of language, your poetry, the video poem is testing edges, peripheries, using like the suggestion really of specters and ghosts and apparitions, things that are tenuous, without solidity. Are you trying to say something in the video about our relationship to such things?
Yes, that it's real. That's what it is.
It's all about us. It's all about us if we but look.
Yeah. No, it's no more or less than that. That idea to me is a compelling notion, and that's what it's about.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so let's go on to your next one, palingenetics.
A quite peculiar place. We have been here before. This memory within bone, within endocrine pulse.
Which you said is revisiting the past to understand the future, calling on a famous text and ancient counting system. My first question is going to be, what is palingenetics?
Okay, palingenetics is a phrase which was originally invented, I think it was invented by Ernst Haeckel. I think he was the first person to use it. Haeckel was an evolutionary biologist working in the late 1800s, early 1900s, who was incredibly influential. He was a good scientist himself. He produced an amazing series of artworks of the microscopic structure of plankton and small sea creatures. He wrote incredible books to popularize science as it was known at the time. It's primarily biology, human evolution. Really, really amazing character. And so the notion of palingenesis can mean different, and the word's been used in different ways. So one is, the way he used it, is the apparent repetition during embryological development of changes that originally occurred in evolutionary development. And so the phrase which was attributed to Haeckel was ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which sounds complicated. Ontogeny is how an organism develops from a fertilized egg through to an embryo, through to the final form. So in that process, you go from a single cell with no external structure that's obvious anyway, to a fully made organism, a full body. It's an amazing process. I started off my scientific life as an embryologist, and I taught embryology for nearly 40 years. It's absolutely one of the most wonderful bits of biology that there is.
Considered as infinities. How many fingers, thumbs, toes? How many circumvolving fates?
Phylogeny is when organisms change their form over time, over evolutionary time, over geological time. So for embryological development, I mean, in us it takes 9 months, but all the early steps only take a few days, and by the end of 4 weeks after fertilization, the basic shape of a human embryo is determined. And some organisms develop from an egg to their final form in just a few days. But evolutionary development takes millions of years. But we must have started off as single cells, just the same way as an egg started off. And the idea for Haeckel's idea for this palingenesis was that as we look at embryos at a certain stage, like human embryos, at certain stages, we have a tail, and we have things which look like gills, like fish have gills. And we have structures which are almost the same as the structures that a bird has in an egg. So it was incredible insight that Haeckel had. What he got wrong was not so much that we go through the stages of being a fish, but we go through stages which, if you were a fish, you'd make gills. But if you're a human, those same structures end up making our jaws, making our mouth and our tongue and our larynx in that particular case. So that's palingenesis as a biological structure, biological thing. In geology, it's used to described a different process of regeneration when rocks that have already been formed by like through volcanic activity or something like that end up being subjected to volcanic activity again, melt again, and make new rocks in a different place, with a different structure. And the third form is a sort of philosophical, so pseudo-philosophical form where you have spiritual rebirth through transmigration of the soul. Yeah, possibly, I suppose. I don't ascribe to that view, but that's all right. But that's what it means. And the fourth version is a really much more problematic use of the word, and that is the ongoing recurrence of historical events that, history repeats. History repeats over and over. Been a song about that. But the 20th century fascists in Germany and Italy used that notion to say that the time for fascism has come because it'd been there in the past, in some mythical past, as it turns out. But now history, the wheel had turned through history, and now it's time for the rebirth of this type of politics, this way of running a society, which was the fascists. So it has a very difficult socio-political framing as well. And that feeds all the way back to Haeckel, because the Nazis drew on Haeckel to support the scientific evidence for Nazism. And I mean, Haeckel was never a fascist. He was a man of his time, but it was a generation before them. So the poem refers to all of those things in some sort of way. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there are very helpful notes at the end of your videos, which tell viewers about some of the ideas, and as it turns out, fairly complex ideas, as you were mentioning, underpinning the poems, so that there are many layers of meaning. Do you conceive of your video poems as exemplifying those layers of meaning by layering sound and image on text as well?
Yeah, sometimes. But in this case, I didn't. In this case, the video for Genesis is Palingenetics, is probably the most simple one I've ever made as a visual, in terms of its visual style. It was actually difficult to make, but it was the end result is quite simple. And in fact, I made the video for a completely different purpose originally. So for the Adelaide Fringe 2 years ago, I was part of a stage production, and they wanted me to make a backdrop video for the production. And so I had to make, it was nearly an hour and a half of video that was projected on a big screen during the performance and before the performance. And the imagery that's part of this Palingenetics video was actually made for that show. And then I edited it a bit and adapted it for this piece. And the music I wrote specially for it, and I wanted to have this sort of quiet looping sort of music, and it's in an unusual time signature. I like playing with unusual time signatures because of the rhythms that they give, and because the poem has a structure built into it, but on base 60, which we can talk about why that was. The music, underlying music, it's in 6/4 time, so 6 beats to the bar, and there are 60 measures. So that determined that then I had to work out how to get the melody and things to fit that, get the text. The reading of the text had to be fitted around that rhythmic structure, and then I had to adapt the video that I already had to fit that rhythmic pattern as well. So that the video itself, it's generated. It's an algorithmic generation these strange sort of shimmering shapes, and I generated. I mean, the video's only a few minutes long, but I had like half an hour of stuff like that to edit between and get it all to flow properly.
Mm. In my viewing of these videos, the way that language and images are used suggests that, to me, you're offering them to viewers just as glimpses. They're not sort of things in their entirety. They're just, because there's so much underneath them, there's so much informing them. They're just little glimpses. Is that a fair comment?
Absolutely, 100% right. Yeah, so they're we've talked about the notion of your conscious experience just sort of flitting around, and you're just having, and actually it's very, very hard to introspect into that process. So, and whenever you do, you only just get a glimpse of it. So they're glimpses. That's exactly right. And the other thing which relates to that, I think, is something which came up at a discussion at one of the video poetry events I was in earlier in the year, where we had an online discussion about making video poems and things. And one of the things which distinguishes most video poems and most video art, I think, from more traditional filmmaking, and to some degree from longer form narrative like short stories and novels in particular, is that the sort of video poems I make, the sort of videos I make, they exist just in their own time. They run for 4 minutes and 23 seconds, and that's it. They're not actually talking about something 2 years ago or 3 years ago or something like that. There's nothing before or after them. There's nothing precedes palingenetics. There's nothing to follow palingenetics. After image, I could make a longer version, or I could make a shorter version, or I could write a documentary about making after image, like we've just been talking about. But that'd be something different. That's not the film. And so there's little films, there's little videos. They're little bits of experience for the viewer.
Wonderful.
And it's not like you're telling a story, like if you have a blockbuster film, something, a classic narrative film or a narrative novel. Sure, that exists in the 90 minutes you watch the film, or in the 3 weeks it takes you to read a fat novel. But within the narrative structure of a traditional film or most novels, you have an implied time frame that the narrative moves through and refers to. Back in 1933, blah blah blah, this happened, or in 2045, this is what we're going to be doing, exploring the universe or something like that. And then you have this narrative arc, this happened and that happened and that happened and that happened. It may not be told in a linear fashion, but you could always go back and pin it into some sort of timeline. And so the film, most of the work that I do doesn't have a timeline. You can't describe the events in that to an external timeline, even though they're linked to the internal timeline to a fraction of a second. They're not linked to an external timeline. Not usually. Sometimes they are, but usually not.
Yeah, the imagery in this one is fluid, swirling, suggestive of movement, a river almost, or silk or something. Is it meant to connote the way that we pass through time, through our lives, through history?
Yes. Yes, it is. So in the original context of the stage show, it was relating to the actor on stage being enveloped in a web, basically. And we want to visualize that. And the colours, again, in the context of the original stage show, was about queerness. so that the rainbow colours relate to that in some way too. But that doesn't matter. That doesn't really feed into the current version of it, though it's important to acknowledge that. So normally my soundtracks are just super abstract, just processed sound from the environment, environmental sounds I collect all the time. Or they're really noisy, loud. I grew up in loud, noisy rock and roll and experimental music and stuff like that. And I like my soundtracks to be loud, to be noisy, strongly rhythmic, lots of distortion and complicated things going on in the sound. But this one, I really stripped it back, and it's probably one of the most simple pieces of music I've ever done from that point of view. Yeah.
All right, well, let's have a think about the next one, or chat about the next one. And furthermore, Index, which you say is a day in the life of a city extracted from the news columns of the local newspaper. And the notes to this video explain what you did. Quote, the text samples every occurrence of "and" in the news pages of the Advertiser, a reputable paper, Adelaide, Friday the 24th of October 2014. It is read by Karen, the Mac OS Australian female text-to-speech generator, providing a snapshot, indexed, of a day in the news of a contemporary city. So my first question is, did you scour papers over several weeks or months to find one that you thought was best suited to the idea of the poem, or did you just choose the first paper you came across?
Just the first one I came across. When I was talking about the interaction between rigorous process and stochastic randomness, that this is a perfect example. I got the idea, and I just grabbed that morning's paper. That day, let's do it. And I just sat there with a writing pad and went through. There's 14. So on the Advertiser, it has up the top of the page, next to the page number, it has what sort of section of the paper that you're in. It. So it's news or sport or games or whatever, finance or whatever. So I just picked, I think there was 14 pages that had news beside them. I just got every example of "and," whatever the next word was. That was it.
Free and friends and fun. And generic and government and grandfather and great and grown and hemorrhage and Hamilton and handling and hit and held and helped and how and husband and iron inappropriate and include and increase and independent and infrastructure and innuendo and inset and institutions and insurance and invited and involved.
Ian, I was wondering whether you were tempted to make this poem part of a series of poems where you take other words, such as "but" as your prompt.
No, I tend not to do things repeatedly. I mean, I generally do things once, and if it works, that's it. And some people have complained. It's been a problem actually that my stuff is they tend to be quite different from each other. I don't like doing the same thing again. That was again goes back to science. It was you do experiments, you never want to do them again. You do go and do something different. So. But I have used sample text previously. So I had an earlier thing I did was, what was it called? Grand Final Edition. It was based on, I took the text from a write-up of the AFL Grand Final, and I just got everybody's names, or the players' first names that were mentioned, and what the next verb was, and just I made an animated text version of that. And that's done really well. That was an earlier piece, but that's the nearest thing I've done to that.
Yeah, no, I thought it would be interesting, for example, if you took the word "and" on a different day and see how different the outcome would be.
Yeah, you get a different story for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, I've corresponded quite a bit with people about translation in poetry and the difficulty of doing that. And this piece, you couldn't translate. it wouldn't make sense to be translated. What you would have to do is the same process on a different newspaper. So, in Germany, you get the Frankfurter Allgemein or something like that, and you pick every example of "und" and whatever the next word is, and you'd use all exactly the same video, the same pictures, but you'd have a completely different text and it'd tell a different story.
Oh, that would be fascinating. I mean, I've always been interested in the idea of putting together a collection, an anthology of poetry, all of which have the same title. But have been written over time by different poets and exploring the same idea in completely different ways. And you could do that with something like this, I'm sure.
Yeah, that'd be fun. Yeah,
it would be fun. To a global thing.
Yeah.
And was this an attempt to sort of capture a sort of an essence of Adelaide, do you think?
Well, it turned out that I had no idea when I did it. I had no idea what was going to happen. It was just an idea to try. And when I and even just having written them out in the order they appeared in the newspaper didn't really strike me as anything particularly interesting. And then I put them in alphabetical order, and saw the appositions which came up then. And I thought, wow, this is something interesting. And then I thought, how am I going to read this? And I actually performed it a couple of times. It's good fun to perform live in my own books. And people get it, people like it. But then I thought, I don't know why I thought of it. Let's just get the voice to text to have a go. I use that a lot, and it sounded amazing with using Karen, and it's actually her voice is doubled up and repitched a bit, and all of the footage there, all of the images in that, except for I think one, all of them are just done with my phone. Just pictures I took as I'm walking around the city. I've got a big, massive file of pictures as I take as I'm walking around. And indeed, this video is it's been selected for a festival in Melbourne in December on phone videos.
Yeah, before I knew what exactly you had done, I viewed it without reading the notes. I just viewed it, and then I was looking for some letters that were missing, like there were no Z's, and there was, and then I realized what you'd done, and of course, they were done in the paper, so you couldn't use them. That turned out being a lot of fun to do.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It was huge fun to do, and it also ends up being a statistical thing on the common letters in English. I think the numbers of words, starting with each of the letters, matches up pretty well what you find in a dictionary.
I was going to say, have you ever gone to the Advertiser and shown them the film?
No, that wouldn't be interested. No. But this is film. This is it's done really well. So it's been screened. It's being screened at the Zebra Poetry Film Festival in a little while, and it's been a few. I think it's been screened in 3 or 4 places already this year around the world. So happy about that.
So the next one's called A Captain's, which you've termed a reconstructed seafaring language as befits a failing colonialist expedition. I'm interested in that sort of insertion of the colonialist expedition, because it's not something that I would necessarily have gleaned from the film. What was your thought behind that?
This is one where the text I had for quite a while was published quite a while ago in Transnational Literature, really, really good publication, which I think is still going. The idea came after reading a novel by, I'm terrible with people's names, West Australian Aboriginal author, novelist, brilliant novelist. I can't remember his name now. Anyway, he wrote a fantastic book about the interaction between, I think it was a missionary and the local Indigenous population, Aboriginal populations in southwestern Australia. And I just had this thing in my head about this sort of these seafaring captains coming with no idea at all really about what they were going to do, quite apart from the traumas and difficulties of being stuck on a little sailing ship, for 3 months or something, crossing the high seas with a bunch of variable people from the other officers down to the deckhands and the crew, dealing with all of the incredible unknowns of what those voyages must have been like. I mean, people talk about what's it going to be like with people stuck on a spaceship traveling to Mars. Well, we've done that experiment. They've done it for 400 years. It's a disaster most of the time. With mutinies and people dying and murdering each other and doing all sorts of other dastardly things. So that was in the back of my mind too. And then this notion of someone being sent out by the Imperial Majesty's Navy or something, the Admiral this or Admiral that, and getting here and just going, Jesus, what are we doing here? So that was the basis for it, really. And then, and of course, there's in the background there's the dealing with the local population, which isn't really what the poem's about very much. And then so I again got talking about making up language. I just decided to pull together words in a way which mimics the type of language of 18th, 19th century diaries of seafarers and explorers, of which I've read quite a few over the years.
Sash my periwig, stow flannel and serge, reft fishbone and lice, stay me my phlegm, boil this black ink regalia, curdlesome I hove, henny pick my ultimatum.
I've just done another one. There's another one I've just finished, which is even more so, and just about all of the words in the piece are completely made up. And I performed that last Friday night, and again, this notion of people getting the drift without knowing what the individual words mean is something I really love.
Yeah, well, it starts with the opening line, which I'm going to read because I loved it so much. Here again, not well, likely a turnspit, jiggered, seafowler swoon, unfeathered on deck mahogany, ocean smooth and tumultuous and heaving, all bilious, curmudgeonly, all at a time. I mean, you must have loved getting curmudgeonly into a poem.
Yeah, it was.
So fantastic. They're words and their juxtapositions of words that surprise and startle. And I think that have an impact on someone viewing it and hearing it.
Oh, thank you, David. This took me ages to write. I have to say, it took me a long time to get it right. And as I often do, not always, because some poems don't, some of my work doesn't allow it, but this one, it had to be the sound. So I'm always was doing this. I was reading it out loud as I was making it to get the changes of sound, the rhythms, the various forms. I had lots of different options. A lot of these words, I had different versions of them, and they had to fit together.
Yeah, I don't know quite how you end up settling on the final version. It's been quite a lot of trial and error.
Yeah.
But it also feels like you're stretching the language around the idea to encapsulate the idea with language, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, thank you. Yes, that's what I try to do. So it's a simple, you sum up the idea in a couple of sentences, but then you stretch the language around it. That's a fantastic description. Thank you.
Yeah. So, how did you know when it was right?
I don't know. You just decide that's enough, and then I suppose, and I love. It's fantastic performing this live, and sometimes you don't feel like changing anything. It's just that. Yeah, that's it. That's done.
Yeah.
Um,
And I like that in the middle of the poem, all of a sudden questions suddenly sort of insert themselves. Whose trajectory scours my sleep? What worriment forth's mildewed land scent? Fabulous. It's fabulous language. Now these questions, their role in the poem, are they subterranean thoughts? Are they musings? Are they worries? Do they designate something else?
all of the above. So again, it's the ambiguity of the language. It's the ambiguity of the phrasing. That's a common thread through all my writing, I think. It's not clear necessarily who the narrator is and whose voice we're hearing. So is it the voice of the captain that we're hearing here? Has his speech transcribed, or has someone else transcribed it? Or is it the poet's voice? Or is it the reader's voice internalising whatever it is they're hearing? Well, it's all of those.
The voice of the ship.
The voice of the ship. Yeah, the voice of the ship. And the captain's is short for a captain's cook, which is rhyming slang for having a look, having a gander. So it's there's an element of that there too. So a bit of taking the piss out of it too. So there's so all of those things are happening at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I really like talking to poets who write poetry I couldn't possibly write. Thank you. Moving on, the next one is the Ferivores, which you've described as a code-generated language for a future dominated by iron-oxidizing bacterial symbionts, which once again suggests a very complicated underlying idea. Tell me about
it. This one is got a really interesting backstory, and one of the benefits of being retired now is that although I don't follow the scientific literature in the way that I used to when I was a working scientist, I'd be reading hundreds of papers in my field every week. I still subscribe to some of the science magazines, and the good thing is that I can read about other types of science, other types of research ideas that I didn't have time to do when I was working. And one of the incredible things which has come up in the last 10, 15 years are these discovery of microorganisms that can get their energy through different ways, different chemical processes compared to most life on Earth. So most life on Earth, plants and animals, get their energy by combining oxygen and sugar to generate energy. So you burn your glucose. And we have to get our energy, animals have to get their energy from eating something else. Plants get their energy stores by photosynthesis, by making glucose directly from the sun, and in the process making oxygen as a byproduct. But some microorganisms can get their energy from other chemicals in the environment. Some use sulfur rather than oxygen. Some can get stuff from copper compounds, and some get their energy from effectively from rust, from iron oxides. And these are type of bacteria. And so the idea for that is that if you burn iron, you get iron oxide, you get rust. It's a combination of oxygen and iron. And that takes energy to make that chemical compound, and that energy is stored there. But if you can break that bond, you get the oxygen back from it, then you get the energy back, and the bacteria can use that. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that iron it is so much a core of our existence that we completely take it for granted. So our blood is red because of hemoglobin. Heme means iron. It's an iron-containing compound in our red blood cells, and that's what binds the oxygen and takes it around our body. So essentially, the chemistry of that is not very different from iron rusting. So how the oxygen binds to the hemoglobin in our blood is on a par with what happens to a bit of freshly polished iron when it goes rusty. Almost the same thing. How it gets off there is completely different, but that's a similar sort of thing. That's the first thing. Second thing is, out in our built environment, it is absolutely, totally dependent on iron. And we talk about the Iron Age as a key step in the sociological history of civilization. We could not live, we could not have our current society without iron. All of the machinery that we have is iron. Everything that we've got around us that has been manufactured depends on iron, either as a component or as a component of the machine that made the items that we work with. We could not have a modern society without iron.
Time, just this. Place, just this. Fear of lust. We do and not. Earlier do and none. Now with no air. Clear blue. No rare earth. Just dry blood. Red and wine. On high wind. As if not yet. In our grass. Not yet. Out of our reach.
And it dries, and you think about BHP and the big iron reserves up at north of Adelaide, up in South Australia and Western Australia, iron knob and places like that. There's huge amounts of the earth going out to make everything that we use, absolutely everything. And then the third thing is that most of the earth is made of iron. So the red soils that we see right through outback Australia are red because they've got iron oxides in them. And a major part of the central part of the earth is molten iron. So inside the earth is a huge blob of molten iron. And that's what makes the earth magnetic, gives us the magnetic poles, North Pole, South Pole, and allows the compass to work. So, and all sorts of things depend on that, not just us, but migrating birds depend on the magnetic fields to find their way from one end of the world to the other. So iron is it. And it's totally overlooked and taken for granted everywhere. So I got this idea then to write something about, imagine if our descendants in the future, in a totally degraded world, environmentally totally stuffed up by anthropogenic climate change and all the other terrible things we've done, we end up thinking, wow, geez, the only way we can keep going is to engineer ourselves to live off iron oxides, become the iron, just like the bacteria, become the ferrivores, the iron eaters. And so that was the idea for the text. So I wrote this text based on that, and the text, it's got a few sort of partly made up words like in Captains, but most of the words, the unusual words, they're actual real words which come from the history of metallurgy. And so I've got a fantastic book published in the 1500s. I've got it's facsimile copy of it, which on how to work metals, and it's fantastic. It's unbelievable, and a lot of the language that was used from that was still used in blacksmiths in England, for example, in the 19th century. They're still using a lot of the same terms and indeed a lot of the same technology until iron production became fully commercialised with the development of blast furnaces and the development of coking coal and stuff like that. So it's a fantastic story. It's easy to find out. Go back, look at the history of iron and the development and the role of iron in the Industrial Revolution. It's fantastic. So that was all the basis of the language. Again, it's ambiguous. It's broken. It's sort of depressing in a way because and then the narrator sort of breaks out of that. We're all going down that hole. At the end, that sort of breaks out of it a bit. And then somewhere along the line, I don't remember how, I got the idea of encoding it as a computer code. as though the voice in the future was a digital voice,
Mm.
no longer a human voice, a mechanical voice. And so I don't know how to code properly, but I can do some coding. So for websites and things like that, I can do that sort of coding. But I can read code quite well. And when I was working, I could read scripts and modify them to do things on my computer that I couldn't do otherwise. So I understand how code works. So I came up with a code language which is entirely internally consistent. It looks like proper code, but it's not. And someday I would sit down and write out and give you all the syntax rules for the code in the FeraVoice. And so the code that's in the video is, in theory, in the context of it, is, hang on, I'm just getting up. So the code that's in the video is, in theory, is what's generating the voice that is speaking the text. And so all the commands and things like that are defining the type, the parts of speech. They're defining the content of the spoken text which follows, and the order in which they appear and things like that. And then last year I did a meta version of this where there's a fantastic journal called Antennae, which is published regularly, a couple of times a year usually. It's been going for a long time, about the interaction between science and technology and art, creative arts in different ways. And somewhere, I can't remember if I asked or I submitted the FeraVoice. They had an issue, and the theme was microbial futures. And so I thought, FeraVoice, it's perfect. And so I sent it off, and they said, yeah, we'll accept that. But it's sort of a semi-academic journal, and they sent out this style sheet on, setting it all up with your references and referring to figures and proper format of introduction and discussion and all that sort of stuff. And I thought, I don't want to do that. But what I will do is we'll have the FeraVoice doing that. And then I thought, well, hang on, now they're already there. Let's have another generation into the future of some sort of digital archaeologists who have discovered this manuscript, this old ancient code by the FeraVoice. And so I did the whole thing, that the meta text on another made up coding language, which had all of the referencing in it, which had all of the citations, had all of the references to the images, all encoded in a pseudo computer code. So it's incredible. And then to make the video, I had this sitting around for a while, and it was a perfectly good text. The text had been published, the original text had been published somewhere international. And Australian journals don't seem to like this stuff much, but internationally it was out there. And then we went for a holiday up in the Flinders Ranges, and I just took my camera gear with me because there's going to be something good to film there for sure. And we'd been there about half an hour, and I realised this was the FeraVoice. This was the environment of the FeraVoice. And so we went on walks everywhere, and I carried my camera gear, which is quite heavy, my big video gear, walking all day, and I'd go out at night and go out in the afternoons, and with a low evening light or early morning light. And I took hours and hours. I must have had 15 hours, 16 hours of video I recorded, and that became the video component of the FeraVoice. So unlike most of my videos, there's almost no image manipulation in those videos. They're all pretty much as shot.
Wow. I mean, it's not hard enough to just have text, sound, and image, but you've got to add computer code as another layer. I mean, it must have been extraordinarily difficult to weave all four elements together in a coherent way. How long did that take you, and how hard was it?
It took ages. I mean, that was probably 2 years on and off working on that. And then doing the meta version, which was published last year, that took me, I don't know, a couple of months, working out how to just do that extra text.
Mm. Um, it's quite evident that, you know, science is a real underpinning of your poetry. To what extent do you think your background as a neuroscientist informs your poetry and video poems?
Well, it's 100%. It really does. It's not just the neuroscience; it's the science in general. So the fearivores isn't anything to do with neuroscience, but that's to do with basic metal science, chemistry, geology. Palingenetics is as much to do with geology as it is to do with embryology or neuroscience. So it informs in two ways. So one is the overall, I suppose, conceptual approach to what I do, and then sometimes after the event, as we've been talking today, to explain why I do what I do. But the other thing is that, I mean, as a scientist, I've got, as a natural scientist, I've got incredible sort of insight into the world below its surface.
Mm.
So, as you know, having taught human anatomy for 30 years, I know what you look like below your skin. You know, looking at your face there, I know what your skull's going to look like. I know what when you smile, I can see your teeth. I've got a pretty good idea, what your jaw's going to look like. I know that sort of stuff. Looking at the window there, you can see the trees out your window, out my window. I know why the trees are green, and how chlorophyll works, and how the photons interact. Coming from I know how the photons are generated in the sun as much as anybody does, from reading the science on that. I know how they travel through space as much as anybody does, and interact with the chlorophyll and generate a green. I know why it's green and not red. Things like that. So, and I know that, and as my background in zoology, I know how animals and plants are related to each other. I know their evolutionary past to a reasonable degree. Since I've been retired, I've got back to natural history, so learning the names of all the local plants, the orchids and wildflowers, or the little insects that I do macro photography of, and things like that. So I know all that stuff, and I can't help but inform my outlook on the world, but also the language. So one of the things about language, we said how bad it is at describing actions and things like that, but it's incredibly good at describing objects. And if you come across a new object, if you know something about that object, it's a natural human thing across all cultures to classify things. They need to fit into some sort of arrangement, and invariably you want to give some name to that arrangement. So if you can see that something is different, and it's different enough to matter, you want to give it a different name. And so names matter. And so coming out of the science background, because science knows all these multiple layers of objects, things, bits of your body, different types of creatures, different types of leaves, different types of molecules, different types of cells. They've all got names.
I think we've got two more. Okay, the next one is,
you don't have to do them all.
No, we're going to do them all. The next one is Future Perfect, which is described as the total breakdown of language to its core syllabic components. So as a reader of ordinary text, I'm looking at language and I'm looking for meaning. I'm trying to get some sense of what the writer is trying to tell me. Having looked at this video, I confess to needing some help here, Ian.
He's a tense note plat some band either hot time or past or not, or I will have all caught off mad when I count bless when we slip between next fanker hub.
There are many words that are not words, and linkages between words and non-words that are a puzzle. What are you trying to do? To ask Paul.
Yeah. yeah, I don't remember how this started, other than the fact that it started off as a proper poem, which I've got somewhere on my system somewhere, about just things going badly, sort of corporate citizens behaving badly and things like that. And
sounds like the real world. Sounds like the real world.
Yeah, exactly. I write, that's the stuff I write about. And for some reason, I wondered what would happen if I stripped off all of the prefixes and all of the suffixes and left just the stem of the word. Right. And this is something which my general interest in language, I really like pulling together words which seem to be unrelated and see what the core meaning is. And I've actually got I've got documents around the place of hundreds of words in them with sort of stem words, and I tend to, that's how, when I make up words like in the captains, that's how I've sort of got this sort of database of word cores, if you like, that I can draw on.
We Nartil with list with uncanny grand radar sick.
The computer text in the Ferrovoice is a bit of it where you have optional words. The coding is saying here's the core word and here are the suffixes and prefixes you can add to it. I did that more on another code poem that was published in Cordite a few years ago, which is I haven't made a video of yet. But that idea of this sort of mix and match between suffixes and prefixes and word stems is, I find, really appealing. And it has to be part of the way in which our brain generates and saves time, makes processing language more efficient. There's not much research on that, actually. When I looked it up, there's very few people have looked into that way in which words are built up of these meaningful subunits as a way of making language more efficient. There is some work on that, and it definitely does make it more efficient as a cognitive process. Anyway, so I'd strip back the words back to their core syllable, and then there were still all the other words, or the prepositions and auxiliary verbs and things like that. I thought, oh, bugger, we don't need them either. And that's what ended up. And I can perform this live.
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
Really hard. It's really hard to read and to perform. I have to practice it and practice it and practice it. But it was I got the text to voice program to do it, and they did a fantastic job. I just accepted whatever pronunciation it came up with. I had to jiggle it a little bit to get the time properly, and I had to edit the sound file. So then that's generated the basis for the soundtrack. But then in the video, so just these bits of words come blasted onto the screen with no other imagery. The timing of those words is the timing that text appears on the screen in most TV advertisements. So I did a project a few years ago where I made, it was for a public art exhibition, and I had a video projected onto the side of one of the big department stores in Rundle Street in Adelaide. And I made it look like it was a poem, but it was all animated. I made it look like a series of advertisements. So it's 45 seconds long, and it's 3 15-second advertisements. And prior to that, I sat there watching commercial TV with a stopwatch, timing the advertisements, timing the scenes, seeing how many words appear on screen, how the words that were spoken matched up with the words that were on the screen. And it's really amazing. And nearly all ads, regardless of what they're doing or what they're trying to sell you, what they look like, follow the same rules. And I've since tracked that back through some commercial sort of advertising sites, and it's true. So the speed with which the words come up on the screen is about the speed that they come up on a typical TV advertisement. So that's driving the timing of the text along with the underlying rhythm of the music. And then in the breaks between the sets of verses, It's just this scrolling text, and they're the middles. They're the words with all of the possible prefixes and suffixes I could possibly think of around that stem, and they just go streaming up. And the whole point of it is saying, using these stems, you could write so many different versions of that text, and they'd mean completely different things, totally different things, depending which prefixes you used or suffixes you used. I've never done that because, in a way, I don't need to. I can sort of imagine it all. But you could sit down there and weave through it and put all the different things on. You'd end up with 40 different versions of the poem. I love that idea. I love the fact that I've never done it, and I'm never going to do it.
You're going to get a chatbot and AI to do it for you.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
I'm just going to move quickly on to the last one, which is an introduction to the theory of eclipses, a remnant corona of language in the face of artificial intelligence. Speaking about AI. You've titled this an introduction to the theory of eclipses and referred to it as a remnant corona of language in the face of artificial intelligence. Can you explain what you mean both by the title and how it relates to the subject of artificial intelligence?
Yes, again, the title comes again from this stage production I did for the Fringe 2 years ago. And this was another bit of the original version of this video was made for that stage production. And one of the characters in the production was called Eclipse. And when he first appears on stage, we had a video running in the background which introduced him and the music. The idea for the video came from the director of the stage show, and she'd seen this video that'd been made by some sort of production company. They were promoting something. They had these two faces with sort of basing cut hairs, two actors with a projected image onto their face. And she wanted to have something similar to that for the production. We couldn't get permission to use the original version. So I said, well, okay, I'll make something like it, but it will have to be different enough that we can't be sued for plagiarism. And so I set about making it and how to do it. And I'd made another video previously, which is not on this list today, where I'd used artificial intelligence generated faces. And in that original video, it was done in collaboration with a fabulous Greek poet and Greek musician. So it was one of the few times I didn't use my own poetry or my own music. But my Greek poet friend wanted to have people in the video. And I said, I don't do people. I don't have access to actors, and I don't go around. I don't like filming people out in the street. It's just not what I do. And then I knew that there are a couple of companies around who are using AI generated faces for research purposes, not for commercial purposes. So I went back and found one of these companies, and then it turned out that the research group there was a company which they were using to generate these faces. So I went and contacted them, and they'd just gone public at the time. And they did sort of this sort of ethical AI, which is interesting in the current context of AI generators. So they had they got somewhere like 1,000, 1,500 models, real people who were paid to come in, and they were all different genders and eventually different ethnicities, different ages, and they were photographed professionally in a professional studio to generate this database of people's faces, and then the AI then generates the faces out of that database. You got to pay for it. It's not cheap as a user to pay for it. It's not impossible, but but it's completely ethical, completely above the board. And I really like that whole idea, both at a technical point of view. It solved a creative problem for us. And I was able to use these faces and animate them and do all sorts of fancy things with them. So then when it came to making this video for the introduction to eclipses, I went back to that library, generated new faces. I needed some 3D models as well, and I went to another site which produces 3D models of all sorts of different things for using in games and movies and things like that. And I bought, again, I didn't steal it. I bought a 3D model of a fairly featureless head, which is the bit which is in the final sequence, and then using all of those things. But then I spent ages and ages animating them all, getting all the visual effects right, superimposing the 2D faces on the 3D model. The eyes in the 3D model were actually mine. I filmed my own eyes, blinking and turning, and picked out the segments and then embedded them in the 3D model. The static scenes, the still scenes, are all just taken with my phone all around Adelaide, Port Adelaide, various places, and they've been composited in different ways to create these artificial visual environments. And the text is derived from the Wikipedia article on eclipses, was the initial source defining eclipses, and then I stripped it right back. I didn't have time for words. Didn't have time that was so fast. I didn't have time to have proper sentences and stuff like that. So here are a whole bunch of words which are related to eclipses and all its different meanings. You know, eclipse is when, you know, the shadow of the moon goes across the earth. Eclipse in birds is when male birds really often in breeding season have really brightly coloured plumage, like blue wrens, for example. When it's not breeding season, they have their eclipse plumage, which is usually just something dull and plain. And then, of course, it's used metaphorically. You know, you eclipse something, you override it. So it was sort of a word cloud I generated based around all those themes, and then just had to edit it hard back to fit the fast rhythm of the underlying music and the really fast scene changes. So that's been shown all over the place. That's what's been incredibly successful. It was actually shown here in Adelaide at an event last week, and it's going to. It was shown last week in Mexico in a Spanish version. And normally when I do bilingual versions, I keep the English text on screen, and then using the same formatting, using the same fonts and everything like that, I build in the translated version, the Spanish version or French version are the ones I've done mostly. But this one, there just wasn't, if I put two lines of text on, it was just too cluttered. It was too much of a mess. So the Spanish version doesn't have any English in it at all, just has the Spanish words coming up. Yeah. And some of the words, it took me, I wasn't sure really what the correct Spanish equivalent was for just a single word, because in English, a lot of those words have got multiple meanings given all this framing of eclipse. So I had to try and find words in Spanish that were equally ambiguous, which sometimes meant using a different word. So the Spanish version will mean something different to a Spanish reader than the English one means to an English reader. They'll generate a different word cloud. Now, I don't know if the Spanish is right. My knowledge of Spanish isn't good enough to know how well I did that. But it was shown in Mexico last week and apparently went really well. So,
from the notes to the video, it says that it was inspired by an Inori prayer. Can you say something about that and what that is and how?
Yeah, that's the video. That was the initial video. That was, so Inori was the company, and prayer was just the name of the video that they made. It's nothing religious or nothing.
Oh, okay.
I haven't suddenly gone philosophical on you
there. It also occurred to me that nanotechnology might be a ripe subject for your video poems. Is that something that you've explored already, or is that something you'd like to explore?
No, I haven't really. I mean, Ferrovoice, I suppose, is the closest to that. It's always something potentially in the mix. I am interested, not in nanotechnology itself. I mean, I follow that, but I'm interested in very small living creatures, organisms. I've been doing macro photography since my PhD days in the 1970s, and I've done a lot of that. And when I first came to Adelaide, I had a big library of images. I used to give talks to the bushwalking society, stuff like that, about spiders and flies and things like that. I stopped doing that for a while for various reasons, but I've come back to it since I've been retired. In fact, you can't see this, but there's my new macro system, which I've got just a couple of months ago. I just ordered another component for that yesterday. So I spent a lot of time out in the garden, a lot of time up in the national parks, just 5 centimetres away, 2 centimetres away from tiny, tiny organisms, tiny insects, tiny plants. I'm very interested in the interaction between plants and insects, especially carnivorous plants like sundews. I've made little mini documentaries about some of these processes. So it's not nanoscale, but it's micro scale. And I was a microscopist for 40 years. I used to run electron microscopes where we could get down to imaging, almost down to individual molecules. We had microscopes that could image single light photons, or detect them to build an image. So that whole scale of things is natural to me. I love working down there.
I get the impression, Ian, that you're enjoying your retirement.
Oh, it's fantastic. I mean, I enjoy it's really important. I mean, one really important thing to say is that most of the time I really, really enjoyed my life at university as an academic. I mean, it was an incredibly privileged position to be in. I had a permanent job. I loved doing the research. I loved doing the teaching. We made a significant impact with our research. For a while there, not just my lab, but our group of labs at Flinders University in the during the 90s, early 2000s. I mean, we were as good as anybody in the world for the stuff that we were doing. We discovered new stuff. We invented new stuff. Worked at microscope manufacturers. It was fantastic. And that faded away. You can't think things change and things move on. As a teacher, I mean, I was heavily involved in designing and running the medical course, courses on biology for engineering students. We had an incredible course where we taught for 5 years. We were commissioned by the state government to run a neuroscience of learning program for teachers, which was unbelievable. It's a fantastic experience, met fantastic people, learnt incredible things. And even the administration, I mean, most of the time, when I was head of department, I was on all sorts of university committees, national committees, and most of the time that was an enjoyable process too. It's all the same thing in a way. You're trying to solve problems, you're trying to get stuff to work, you're trying not to drive people crazy, you're trying to deal with the people who do drive you crazy, and trying to do it all and stay awake and not die in the process. And it's incredible. But by the same token, it was getting harder and harder. Or the bureaucratic changes, the political changes in the university system. I'd been in the system so long, I realised I could retire on my superannuation quite happily with my relatively modest means. And so when I turned 60, I did. And I already had some creative work going. I already had a book published, a poetry book published. I'd already had one really big collaborative exhibition, art exhibition. And I had another one lined up. And Judy, my wife, had already retired, and she transitioned into a full-time artist as well. Again, incredibly successful in her domain. So I knew what it was like. And plus, and the beach, I'm a beach person, and I started surfing when I was 15, and now finally, hitting nearly 70 now, I can go down the beach anytime it's good. Like I was down yesterday, was windsurfing yesterday. So,
well, it's been wonderful that your video poems have flowered in the last 10, 15 years. And thank you so much, Ian, for sharing those poems with us. It's been fascinating and exploring your insights on the theme of limits of language, limits of experience. We could go on, but we've got to stop. Links to Ian's video poems will be posted with this podcast, so please look out for them. We'll return in a month or so with Esther Ottaway on the theme of autism, ADHD, and gendered diagnosis. See you then.